Is working remote bad for your career? This is definitely a question that has been up for discussion, especially in the last few years with companies going remote from the pandemic, and then even post-pandemic with more people choosing to stay working remote, even with many companies who are pushing for either working full-time in the office or working hybrid. I think this is definitely a very hot topic, especially for those of you who may be considering switching to a remote role, or if you're currently a student and are looking for an internship or full-time job, and you're looking for your options and trying to understand whether or not working remotely will affect your career in the long term. So we'll be going over a few different topics. I think there's definitely a lot to discuss, from the recession and the layoffs to quiet quitting to the long-term career implications of working remotely and everything in between. So just as a little bit of background for anyone who is new to my channel, I'm currently working as a cybersecurity analyst, and I was originally working in the office before the pandemic, and then I transitioned to working remotely after, and I did that for about 2 years before my employer decided that it was time to go back to the office. And at that point I made the career decision for myself to switch to a remote job, and I left my previous company for my current company, and since then I've been working remotely for the past 6 months or so. Actually about 7 months now, which is kind of crazy. Time definitely flies fast. But of course this decision was made with many conversations and hours of going back and forth and thinking about what this meant for my career as well as my long-term career trajectory. So I do kind of want to kick off this video with what I personally think, and in my opinion, I do not think that working remotely will negatively impact your career if you are working for a company that still values you as a remote employee. I'm sure you guys have seen the articles about CEOs and companies saying that remote workers are going to be the first to go in a layoff or something along the lines of that. And personally, I believe that if someone's able to do their job and do their job well, even while working remotely, then I really don't think that there is a cause to be able to let someone go just because they're choosing to not come into the office 5 days a week. And of course that is a risk someone is taking if their manager is asking them to come in and they just don't want to come in. But personally, I think that people can be just as productive, even more so, when they're working from home compared to when they're working in an office. Personally, as someone who used to work in the New York metro area, when I was working in New York, I had to take a 30-minute train into the office, and then I had to walk about 7 or 8 blocks. And then after work, I would do that same hike home, and basically for an hour a day I was on the train. So including the walking and the train, I was basically commuting to work for about an hour and a half a day, and throughout a week period that's about 10 hours or so. And personally, I enjoy having that 10 hours of my life back to myself, whether it's doing something productive at home, whether it's doing something productive at work. I can get more done during my work day while I'm working from home. It also just makes life so much more convenient, especially if you're someone who may have family obligations or children. But of course, with this discussion, it also goes into the topic of having less visibility or less career growth. Now again, I don't think this necessarily affects people who may already have their full team remote. I definitely feel very lucky that my team is very flexible with where we work, and the fact that the work that I do isn't necessarily tied to a specific state or a specific city, and that's something that I really appreciate. But of course, if you're in a company that is more so hybrid and requires you to be in the office for a certain amount of time, and you are someone who may not be doing that, then there can definitely be implications of a feeling like you're not as close to your team, maybe you're not as in touch with your manager. But honestly, I think that is definitely a conversation to have with your manager during your next one-on-one, because it really is a team and a company culture thing. And by the way, this is also something we discussed in our Tech and Boba podcast for working remotely and how it impacts your career. So I'll link that down below if you guys want to hear more about this whole conversation between Luca and I. And the podcast is available on Spotify. But essentially, it's the fact that maybe you're having a team meeting and everyone's in the same conference room and you're dialing in and you're the only one on a screen. You feel like you're not as included as part of the conversation. That is a team culture thing. And I really think that being outspoken about this is going to be important for your career if you're someone who's choosing to work remotely while other teammates choose to work in the office. So making sure that you have that conversation with your manager or even teammates and just letting them know how you feel. Maybe you feel a bit isolated from the team, or you don't feel as included in certain events if they're going out to lunch. For example, if they're going out to lunch once a week, maybe instead of going out to a restaurant, we can instead eat together in a office setting. And even something as small as that can make a huge difference in terms of camaraderie and feeling connected to your coworkers, because they may not even be aware that they're making you feel isolated, and you definitely want to let your manager know. It's definitely not an easy conversation to have that you're feeling a bit isolated from your team because you're working remotely, but I do think it's an important one unless you're looking to find a new job or a new team that is more so majority remote. And of course, that's always a decision that you'll have to make at the end of the day for yourself. And another thing we discussed is the fact that if you are working remotely and maybe you're an introvert and you don't often feel comfortable speaking up on calls, this is something that I went through even in my first year working in the office. And I was in the office. It's not like I was working remote at that point, but I still was uncomfortable speaking up during calls. And I really think that it is a team culture issue again. For example, if there's someone on your team who is very outspoken and maybe they are always the first to answer a question, maybe they're the first to ask a question on something. If you're less outspoken, which I personally am, I always found myself just not saying a word in the entire meeting. And then at the end of it, having my manager tell me, you need to speak up more. And while I believe that is definitely good feedback, it definitely would help my career if I spoke up more, but also I didn't feel speaking up when someone else may have already asked the questions that I wanted to ask. It definitely can be a tricky situation, especially if you're someone who is brand new to corporate, which I was. I had no idea what to expect when I went into my first full-time job, and it's definitely gotten a lot better now as I've had experience talking on meetings and giving presentations, but in the beginning it definitely is very hard. For example, there's so many times when I am sitting in on a meeting and maybe we're almost nearing the end of the meeting and you have a question, but there's already an ongoing conversation and you don't want to jump in and cut someone off, or maybe you want to let the other person ask their question first. In those scenarios, as someone who is less outspoken, I'm less likely to ask my question. Now, of course, another thing is recessions and layoffs, and these are definitely terms that have been thrown around in various different news articles, especially around tech workers and tech layoffs. So while I don't think that there is any job out there that is necessarily recession proof, like I mentioned in the beginning of the video, there are articles out there that mention things like CEOs are threatening to lay off remote workers first. Every company is going to have a different say on this, but just know that depending on the company you work for, you may be more at risk of coming in contact with a layoff compared to someone who is working in the office, maybe has more face time with the manager. But of course, all these could be up for speculation, and it really depends on your team, your manager, your company. While of course this could be a risk, I don't think necessarily that this should be a huge part of your decision for working remotely. Especially working in cybersecurity, there's still many tens of thousands of jobs, and I don't believe you'll be in the job market for very long as a cybersecurity professional. So personally for me, I would take the risk and work remotely. I do have my course on how to get your first cybersecurity job, and that is coming out within the next few days, so definitely keep an eye out for it. But final thoughts on recessions and layoffs while working remotely, I don't necessarily think that working remotely puts you at a higher risk of getting laid off, even if there is a very small number of companies that may be saying those things and the media is sensationalizing that news. And I do briefly want to touch on quiet quitting, which is a term that I recently learned about in the last few months. And while it isn't necessarily tied back to whether or not working remotely is bad for your career, I do think it is an interesting topic to talk about, especially when it comes to giving people grace. I watched that one CNBC video about them defining quiet quitting, and personally, I don't think this is the right way to phrase the term. I really believe that it's the fact that many people were burned out from the pandemic, working remotely and having high levels of productivity, dealing with a worldwide pandemic, dealing with shutdowns, not seeing their family, not seeing their friends, not traveling or using their PTO. It basically is just a whole environment to get burned out. And in a world where the only thing that you can do is work, there are many people I know who are putting in 10, 12, 14-hour days just because they were at home and they had their work laptops, and because of the fact that they were locked down at home, there was really nowhere else that they could go. So personally, I think that we're still coming off of that burnout phase for a lot of people, and now also going into now this phase of recession, and with people getting laid off even after working really hard at their company, or not getting that promotion that they worked really hard for, or not getting a raise that they were promised. Basically just a whole buildup of things going on that definitely led to a very widespread burnout. And personally, the term quiet quitting itself really just sounds like someone doing their job, someone doing the job that they were paid to do. Because in the examples that they were using, they were saying things like, oh, well, when your manager expects you to work overtime, then you should do it because you want to get promoted, you want to work hard at your job, you want to XYZ. But I really think as more and more people after this pandemic have really seen that life is short, and so many people are reevaluating their personal values, what they want out of their life. Do they want to work to live or live to work? These are all important questions that everyone really just faced head on out of nowhere. And I just found it very weird that they were bashing on people who are working the 8-hour workday when that is literally how long a workday is supposed to be. If someone expects you to work 10 hours a day, then they should be paying you overtime for the extra 2 hours. And the video just made it sound like employees should expect to work longer hours, 50, 60 hour, 70-hour weeks if they want to get ahead and grow in their career. Well, I still think that hours put in, hours clocked in, does not at all correlate into your productivity or how much work you get done. But of course, that was one CNBC video that I really didn't think shed light on this issue in the correct lens. It really just made people sound super lazy, unmotivated, don't want to move forward in life. And honestly, if that was the case, then it really is the environment that people are put in. But anyways, I digress. I've talked about this for too long. Obviously, I'm very passionate about this topic, but I think that is where I'm going to end this video. The last thing I wanted to touch on originally was for similar pay. While there are remote jobs that are paying their employees less for working remotely, there are still many companies out there who are paying comparable salaries as well as even higher salaries than those who may be working in large metro cities. So I would definitely keep that in mind. There is a company out there who is willing to pay you that market rate for your job title and for your skills, even if you don't live in a big price tag city like New York or San Francisco. But looking for that company is going to take some time. That also means that you may not necessarily accept the first offer that comes your way. Personally, I was fully committed to looking for my next job for about 2 or 3 months. I was interviewing for about that time period. I had 3 offers in that time, and I accepted my third one. So obviously I had to reject the first 2 before I even got that last one, which is always a very scary thing. But I really do think that the job you want is out there for a fair salary if you're taking your time to look. But it just may take some extra time to find it. Alright, so that's it for this video. Let me know if you guys have any questions in the comments below, and I'd love to start a discussion for anything that you may agree with or disagree with in anything that I covered in this video. I post videos every Wednesdays and Sundays at 12 p.m. and hopefully I'll see you guys in my next video. Bye!